This is the Russell Moore Show, brought to you by the Public Theology Project at Christianity Today, where every week we explore conversations and questions from a Christian perspective. And as you know, every once in a while, what I like to do is a segment called Tell Me Where I'm Wrong. This isn't really one of those because we're going to have some things we disagree about, but we're also going to have a great deal of agreement. So there's not one specific issue that we're sort of talking about, but we'll still abide by my rules for Tell Me Where I'm Wrong, which is if we do come into areas of disagreement, I'm not allowed to debate. I'm allowed to ask questions for information and to reflect on that. And so it may be we don't even get into that territory. But if we do, Kristen, you call me out on it and tell me that I'm breaking my own rules. So our guest today is Kristin Du Mez, Calvin University, who is the author of Jesus and John Wayne, which is a book that it's not often that a scholarly work of history becomes a kind of viral read, but this time it did. I would find people all over the place, especially conservative evangelical women, who would sometimes whisper and say, I've been reading Jesus and John Wayne, and there's a lot that really describes what we've all seen in recent years. And so this has really shaped and reshaped a great deal of conversation and debate on some really important issues, because this intersects with a lot of things that we've seen over the past several years. I had Kristin with me at the University of Chicago this semester, talking to our students really about the entire history of not just evangelical Christianity, but the overlap between religion and culture and politics and all of those things this semester. It was really fascinating. So I wanted to have her on to have this conversation with you. Kristin, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You know, I mentioned to you the other day that I have a list that I sort of keep in Google Keep of milestone dates. So that I can sort of think about, this is the date of my baptism, or this is the date of some significant thing happening. One of those dates is October the 7th, because this was the day in 2016 when the Access Hollywood tape released with a candidate for president talking in really, really shockingly crude and violent, I would say, terms about women. And one of the reasons that I marked that as a defining point is because I thought, a lot of my fellow evangelicals who have been well-meaning, they didn't really understand what was going on here, they'll stand up and repudiate this. And they didn't. Instead, I started hearing, this is just locker room talk and so forth. And even some of them who did say something about it then later changed their mind and turned around. So I was surprised, and I think it's fair to say rattled by that. But I think you would say I shouldn't have been surprised by that. Is that right?
Yeah, going back in time, that day too for me is a kind of a turning point. It was in the aftermath, the days after that event, that I knew I needed to write this book. And it was because I, years earlier, more than a decade earlier, I had started researching evangelical masculinity, and particularly what seemed to me a really militant strand of it in the early 2000s, this kind of warrior ideal. And I'd spent a year and a half looking into it, and I was was disturbed by what I saw. I encountered deeply misogynistic, crass teachings about masculinity that were, cloaked as Christian, and I also saw the implications in terms of militarism and foreign policy. And I was exploring all of those things, and then I set the project aside, and I partly because I wasn't sure if what I was looking at was really a fringe movement, and if as a Christian scholar, if I should be, if it was fringe, if it was right for me to shine what might be a bright light on the darkest underbelly of American Christianity, to be honest. So I set it aside, but I didn't stop paying attention to some of the proponents of this really militant Christian manhood. And what I saw in the ensuing decade is one after another become implicated in scandal, in sexual abuse, in abuse of power. And I saw these repeated patterns of people surrounding them, condoning that, defending them, blaming the victims. And so in the days after the Access Hollywood tape release, it suddenly dawned on me when I heard all of the excuses, when I heard the justification, when I saw that conservative evangelicals were sticking with him because he was going to defend them. And it's kind of boys will be boys mentality. All of a sudden it clicked. I had heard this before. I'd seen this before. And it's at that point that I realized kind of what we were looking at, and that it wasn't an aberration. This wasn't a betrayal of core evangelical values. In many ways, this is the fulfillment of the shape that I'd seen evangelicalism take, particularly around issues of gender and masculinity.
Okay, well, let's take several parts of that that I'm interested in exploring. One of those things would be, you talk in the book and elsewhere about this idea of militancy, of sort of a warrior Christ. Would it be fair to say that sometimes there is an overreaction to the last bad thing? And so you have a picture in Scripture of a very complicated Jesus who is Revelation 19. Appearing in the sky drenched in blood. I mean, this is a warrior, someone who's coming out of the house of David. When Mary, when the Annunciation happens, she starts singing about military victory in terms of the Abrahamic covenant. So there's that aspect of it. Do you think that sometimes there's a flipping back and forth from a very soft, gentle Jesus, where people go to the New Testament and say, that doesn't really fit everything there, to this sort of hyper-masculine, battling everyone and stacking up the enemies, Jesus? Do you think that there's some of that's an overreaction for people?
Yeah, I think you can see a kind of cultural pendulum swing when we look at perceptions of masculinity, of Christian manhood. But I would complicate that just a little bit, and what maybe some assumptions there of, what is masculinity and what is femininity, and that there's a lot of kind of cultural packaging that goes on there, and that shapes kind of theological conceptions as well. So as a historian of gender, I'm attentive to the ways in which what it means to be a man changes dramatically over time, what it means to be a woman changes over time, and how in recent decades, conservative evangelicals have tended to emphasize difference, emphasize opposite. So what it is to be a man is the opposite of what it is to be a woman. So strength versus vulnerability, and, protector versus protected. And what happens then is many of the attributes that are held up as, for all Christians, as followers of Christ, things like the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, these get labeled feminine, I think erroneously so. And then other traits like courage or assertiveness get labeled masculine. And so what you see is this real artificial division of Christian virtue in a way that isn't good for virtue, it isn't good for men, and it isn't good for women.
So what would you say to someone who says, Well, that probably did go too far, but it's a Flannery O'Connor push back as hard against the age as the age pushes on you, and you're in a time when gender distinctions are evaporated and erased, and there's a great deal of confusion about, well, what does it mean to be a person first, but then what does it mean to be a man or a woman? And so emphasizing the differences, that's because no one else will acknowledge them. What would you say to someone who sort of gets into that mode of argumentation here?
So I actually don't have these kinds of arguments all that often because as a historian, I tend to be quite descriptive. So describing, how people have these arguments rather than telling people what they ought to think, right? That's what historians can do here is just bring in the context and say, this is, how this set of individuals are making sense of their world. This is how they're making sense of masculinity in this moment. And this is how they're interacting with the Christian scriptures in this moment. So I have some expertise in that area. When it comes to telling people what they ought to think and what they ought to do, that's where, I'm kind of an amateur in a sense. I do have some opinions, though. But here I think that the biggest caution would be to stay close to the scriptures. And to take the scriptures in their entirety. Certainly we can look at specific passages, but to remember that, the vast majority of the scriptures that we have as a guide to our faith and to our lives are written for women and men alike. And to remember that Jesus, in so many ways, was radically countercultural. As a man, as a human, as a Messiah, in so many ways, Jesus disrupted human expectations. And he did so in a way that was, divesting himself of power. And that's what's so extreme. And he calls all of his followers to take up our cross and to follow him in that. And I think that for masculinity, for femininity, this radical countercultural self-sacrifice and a courageous self-sacrifice, right, is the model of what it is to follow Christ. And then maybe way down the road, we can think about, as a woman, what does that look like? As a man, but even there, that's assuming a binary that each of us, as God created us in all of our diversity, should be fit neatly into a category of this is what it is to be a Christian man, this is what it is to be a Christian woman, instead of thinking about the creativity of each of us being uniquely gifted in so many different ways. And we do have a spectrum that if you look at certain traits, that might fit more with masculinity or with femininity, that might be exhibited more by men than by women. So physical strength, things like that. Even there, you have a lot of variety. Women who are very physically strong, women who are not, men, same thing, right? And so rather than trying to enforce boxes on created reality, maybe to think in terms of variety and of giftedness and of the body of Christ really being a diverse mix, and that each of us can seek to respond faithfully to how God has created us as gendered individuals and just as individuals. And I think that, when I look at the history, when I've interviewed people, when I hear from readers of Jesus and John Wayne, I hear heartbreaking stories from women, but also from men, from so many evangelical men who tried to fit themselves into an artificially constructed box. That to be a man is to love to go rock climbing on the weekends, or to not like to go to an art museum on the weekends. And so many men...
The wild game dinner at the men's breakfast.
Exactly. And felt that either they weren't real men or that Christianity wasn't for them. And I think that's what we really want to move away from.
Of course, my colleague here at Christianity Today, Mike Cosper, has a podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that, to be honest, I thought would at the beginning, I thought, well, this will be a very interesting podcast for those of us who remember Mars Hill and who are looking at the history of it all in light of some of the things that have come to light since then. But it has gone everywhere, and there are people listening to this podcast who haven't even, weren't even born when Mark Driscoll was in his heyday. I'm curious what you think about. I had a pastor in the area who was talking about some young men from his church who would go to Mars Hill sometimes for the services, and they would just sort of sit in the balcony. And he said what was going on there was a kind of catharsis, because what Mark would do is come in, and I think some people don't really remember this. There was a sense of a hyper masculinity turned against men in one sense. So there was a very strong denunciation of young men for mistreatment of women and porn and not getting their lives together and those sorts of things. And this pastor said it was almost like going to confession and paying an indulgence. You had that, and then you could leave and sort of go back to normal. But why did the Driscoll phenomenon, both what we saw publicly and what we know was happening privately, why did that resonate, at least to the degree that it did?
Yeah. Often in my research for Jesus and John Wayne, I felt like I was running up against the limits of my discipline. And I several occasions really wanted to pass the baton to psychologists. And I've talked with a couple psychologists since the book published and been exploring some of these things just a bit. But that said, I think there is one of the interviews that I did that was really illuminating. And I have a portion of this in the book, was a young man who said, there was something incredibly empowering about the teachings of somebody like Driscoll, and that each of us, mediocre white guys, like nothing special, we're called to greatness, and we were called to lead, and all we had to do is just really step up, and as he put it, keep our noses clean, and and it was being handed to us, and it felt really good. And it felt empowering, and not empowering just in a bad way, but for young men who are seeking purpose, who are trying to figure out who they are in life, what they ought to be doing, and this is all couched in the language of this is what God wants for you, and I think it's important to keep that in mind too. That this is, a lot of people who have been drawn into these sorts of teachings genuinely are seeking to honor God and to do God's will. And they're being told by their pastors, in their churches, in their small groups, with their brothers in Christ, this is what it looks like. And so I think it's enticing, I think it's empowering, and I think that there is genuine belief here as well. But then, of course, we have to ask, how is this affecting people? And what are these men not able to see? And I've been really surprised and impressed with the reception of my book among so many conservative white evangelical men and white evangelicals generally who are using it to examine their own participation in this culture, but not just in a distancing kind of way, like what was done to me. I've had a number of readers ask the next question, which is, why was I so comfortable with this, right? How could I be complicit in this? Now that I see really what was going on, now that I see how all these pieces fit together, now that I see what harm was done to so many others, to women, to people outside of these communities, to people inside of these communities, what was it that blinded me to this harm, and why was I so comfortable? And honestly, I think that is such an important question. I think that is a question that many of us ought to be asking.
One of the things that's really illuminated quite a bit for several of us is the sexual abuse scandals that have happened within evangelical, not only within evangelical Christianity, but we have John Howard Yoder in the Anabaptist tradition, all the way over to things in the secular world and the Roman Catholic Church and elsewhere. But when we look at evangelical Christianity with people who often were the very ones warning about sexual anarchy and the sexual revolution and so forth, who we later find were involved themselves in sexually predatory behavior. As you look historically, is this just something that I ask this question all the time about various things. Is this just the way history works and the way life is, and we sort of lose our ideals and our illusions, or is there something uniquely dark in this way about this time?
Yeah. Ooh, so I'm a Calvinist, so I don't speak in terms of uniquely dark with all that much confidence, right? I think that there are temptations, and basic human temptation is grasping power over others, and then at the same time, yes, this does seem a little bit unique in the circumstances, with such an emphasis on purity, right? Such an emphasis on sexual purity being a marker of faithfulness, and of enforcing that, drawing those boundaries, and particularly for young women, for generations, right? To, kind of Christian discipling. If you were a teenage girl from the 1980s up to, the last few years, really, a lot of that was how to not have sex, how to stay pure, and then once you're married, how to have sex to please your husband. It was really centered in terms of being a godly young woman, and we can talk about that and some of those implications, but then the hypocrisy, to see that so many of the men who were preaching this and who were enforcing this were predatory. And then, historically, when I went back and looked at these teachings on sexuality, when I read the sex manuals from the 1960s and the 1970s, I could just see plain as day how these values were setting women up for a victimization, really, being told that it is up to you as a woman to protect purity because men are filled with testosterone. Restraint isn't really their thing. It's up to you. You have to protect it through your modesty, and then you have to protect purity when you're married by meeting your husband's sexual needs. And it's one thing to read this, in a sex manual or in advice to a young wife. Another thing to just hear this over and over again when among community members, when a pastor, a leader is caught in sexual misconduct, and then to hear exactly these teachings coming back, and it's the wife's fault, blame the woman, blame the young girl for seducing her own father, right? It is just horrifying to read this, and this isn't just every once in a while. This becomes a repeated pattern, and yes. So as a historian or as a Christian, I can fall back on, sin and power, and it's pervasive. As a historian, it does seem like this is a uniquely troubling situation.
There's a new book that I'm reading now that argues that one of the reasons we have so many awful people in power is because awful people tend to be the ones who don't mind being in power. Yes. And the analogy that this book is using, or the phenomena that it's looking at, one of the phenomena it's looking at is school boards. And so he would say, 20 years ago, someone would run for school board because he or she really cared about education in the community. Now, in a time where that person is going to have to endure being screamed at and sometimes having their families threatened and so forth, the people who are willing to risk all of that tend to be Machiavellian, narcissistic, sometimes psychopathic people. And as he was talking about this, that really had a lot of parallels for me with what often goes on in the church. Do you think that that's historically the case as well? Just sort of not so much that the power corrupts, but the people who are corruptible, which is the name of this book, corruptible, are the ones who want the power. Does that thesis make sense to you?
I mean, it does up to a point. It's certainly something I've struggled with when I try to make sense of, okay, where do we go from here? How can we have better institutions, healthier institutions? Because there's a bit of a conundrum when I look at the history. I look at somebody like Jerry Falwell Sr., Jerry Falwell Jr., Mark Driscoll, these figures, or we could say Doug Wilson, these empire builders, really, that they really were deeply concerned about amassing power. And now they could say, and would all say that they were doing so for godly reasons. But you can see some really detrimental effects. And at the same time, wow, did they get things done? Wow, did they influence culture? And we could go, those are more extreme examples. We could also look at somebody like John Piper and Desiring God and the Gospel Coalition. These really, these organizations that end up having massive reach. And then, what does it take to make something like that work? What kind of a vision, what kind of leadership, what kind of exclusions go into that? But in the case of leaders like Falwell or Driscoll, yes, they seem incredibly narcissistic, and they had enormous power. Reach. They influenced generations of American evangelicals. And when I look at kind of more wholesome models, and when I look at some of the teaching, say, when I look at what happened in the evangelical left in the 1960s, 1970s, when I look at those evangelicals who were on the forefront of civil rights, of racial justice, who were questioning Christian nationalism or links between American Christianity and American militarism, and stepping back from that, they weren't able to amass the power, nor necessarily did they desire to do so. Their models were much more collaborative. They were very conscious of power. And so I'm a bit at a loss, honestly, as a historian looking back, because I can see the dangers of grasping power. I can also see the effectiveness, in a bad way in many cases, of having somebody at the center who knows how to consolidate his own power. And it's been enormously effective and often in detrimental ways. So I don't know.
You mentioned Christian nationalism, and one of the things that I'm curious about is when you're looking at this historically, of course, in Jesus and John Wayne, you talk quite a bit about the Cold War and the effect of the Cold War on evangelical identity and so forth. It seems to me that there's continuity and discontinuity.
Yes.
So one of the things that I have seen since I was 5 and able to pay attention to it is this sort of God and country idea of the United States as being in covenant with God in a Second Chronicles 7:14 sort of way. It seems to me that has grown and maybe mutated from that to something even stronger in alliance with some ethno-nationalist movements, and the prizing of people who often not only are not Christians, but will ridicule, for instance. I mean, one of the figures that's been very influential here argues that that you shouldn't even argue against theism because it's not even worth taking seriously, and sort of a Nietzschean view of Jesus as weak, and so forth. Am I seeing that correctly, that there's something that was sort of in seed form, but then has altered a little bit as time has gone on, maybe in coincidence with the Trump era, maybe because of that? Am I seeing that accurately?
No, I think that is a good way of depicting what's happened. And it's important to keep in mind that, Christian nationalism versus, patriotism, or there's a whole spectrum here. And that many, kind of God and country Americans, Christians who see nothing wrong with having a flag up in front of their church, who, like to shop in the for patriotic home decor at Hobby Lobby, things like that, that there's a full spectrum. So many of those people who might be, comfortable with a certain level of Christian nationalism that I frankly am not, are not necessarily one and the same with white nationalists. However, where alliances are drawn, right? Where people say, yes, we are the same, we are on the same side. This is where questions of identity come in. And I think for many conservative Christians, being a kind of God and country Americans is part of their identity as Christians. And so when they see some of these more secular figures or some of these extreme examples, the affinities are in that direction rather than, say, the other direction where you're going to get more of a critique, where you're going to get more of a, no, or actually we need to lament our nation's sins. We need to examine our nation's shortcomings, right? That's where we ought to be engaged. And so one of the themes really of my research for the book was trying to map out these affinities, how identity is constructed. And what I came to see is in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of conservative white evangelicals ended up identifying with secular conservatives around ideals of masculinity, around ideals of whiteness, of even in some cases white supremacy, and that their religious and cultural identity was formed around those values, and so separates them from evangelicals, other evangelicals, who might hold very similar theological beliefs, but a different application of those beliefs when it comes to politics or when it comes to identity issues. And I think that's very much where we're still in that space today. And one of the challenges for evangelicals, for American Christians, is to figure out, what that we are assuming or stating is, biblical Christianity or God's word is in fact, on the left, on the right, shaped largely by maybe secular ideals or identities. And how can we kind of peel back some of those layers and come together and take another look at the scriptures and kind of build up from there again?
One of the places where I think you and I might see things differently is it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the things that you're arguing in Jesus and John Wayne is that there's no such thing as evangelicalism theologically, that there is no theology there, except maybe as a mechanism, a means to an end. That instead, what evangelicalism is a sort of cultural, political, consumer identity. Am I seeing your argument correctly on that?
I'm not quite so extreme. I'm not such a relativist.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a cultural historian, right? And I've written on this in other places about how evangelicalism is an imagined religious community, in that many different people define it in many different ways. And so I would imagine you would define it more closely attuned to the Bebington Quadrilateral, the theological definition, right? Biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism. Or, go to the website of the National Association of Evangelicals. First and foremost, these are Bible-believing Christians, and go from there. Or we could add Barna and have a few more points to check off. I'm not saying that isn't what you should say evangelicalism is, right? As a kind of aspirational ideal, as an evangelical leader, by all means, go for it. For me, as a cultural historian describing what I'm seeing, I ran up against some issues with that definition. First of all, I was aware of surveys that evangelicals themselves are doing that show high levels of theological illiteracy, high levels of heresy, if you will, right, among evangelicals. And so I started to question how central is traditional theology to evangelical identity. Or should we say those aren't evangelicals, right? If we're using a theological rubric, or do we have to look somewhere else for what it means to be an evangelical? When I looked at the issue of race in particular, all those theological beliefs, the majority of Black Protestants check all those boxes. The strong majority of Black Protestants who check all those boxes do not identify as evangelical. So right there, as a cultural historian, I pay attention to that because they know there is more to being evangelical than simply checking off those boxes. And I want to take that seriously. I want to take seriously when people self-identify as evangelical and don't know this theology, or theology isn't central, who are they and what do they mean by that? And that's what pulled me more into a different understanding of evangelicalism, not disconnected from theology. Theology plays a role, but it's not limited to that. And so I don't actually give a definition of evangelicalism. I'm more in the description territory. Right? I'm not looking for a timeless rubric that I can impose over all space and time. That's not what I do as a historian. I'm looking at, in this particular historical era, who is identifying as evangelical? What does that mean to them? What does it look like? And that's where I end up really understanding evangelicalism as a consumer culture, people who are shaped by these products, these cultural products, Christian radio, Christian music, Christian publishing, and as a series of networks and alliances. Again, these parachurch organizations, some denominations, individuals, affinities, and that's how I try to map out what evangelicalism is. And I pay attention to how evangelical leaders and theologians are defining it. I just don't privilege that definition over more of an understanding of evangelicalism and what it means to ordinary evangelicals who are participating in it.
I see a lot of parallel with some of the things happening in the Republican Party and within movement conservatism, because one of the things the Trump era has done is to resort all of the alliances. And so there will be lots of us who will be in conversation. And I'll be talking to, say, Jewish William F. Buckley sorts of conservatives.
Yes.
Who will say something along this line. We always knew that there was a fringe. We always knew that there were kooks and loons and nuts. But we assumed that they were the fringe, and we assumed that most people really were motivated by limited government and Burkean understanding of the role of tradition and of culture and a strong national defense and so forth. And then you come into this moment where you look around and you say, oh, wait a minute, that actually wasn't what was uniting the coalition. And so you have some people who are really rattled by that and saying, well, what happened? It seems to me that a lot of that is the sort of reflection that's taking place within evangelicalism. And just as sometimes these conservatives who said, I'm not going to go along with the populist, demagogic sorts of forms of ideology that are present right now, we'll have people who will say, well, you should have seen this coming 40 years ago, and therefore you can't see it coming now. It seems like there's a lot of parallels there with some people saying, well, I mean, I think about when we're talking about even these gender conversations, the fact that I look back and I see there are places where an understanding of gender roles is actually more important than the eternal generation of the Son. I mean, literally conciliar ideas. Is that a fair parallel, or am I just seeing that?
I'm seeing it too. We're both seeing it, right? I mean, yes. There's so much there in what you just said. Yes, there's a new sorting happening. There's a new recognition of what was fringe is not fringe, and maybe it never was. Maybe, it depends where we were looking. If we were looking to, define evangelicalism according to what was going on at Christianity Today and Wheaton College, we missed something here. And this is really really part of the writing of this book, right? I'd set it aside 15 years ago, thinking, is this really, if this is Fringe? And it was in the fall of 2016, I thought, no, this is not Fringe. I need to do this. And then we start, a story of the book is, what is mainstream and what is Fringe? And then what is the relationship between what was perceived as mainstream and this Fringe? And this is where we can get into, I think, where you're going with this question too. Should we have seen this coming? When we look back to evangelicalism, and race and gender. And even though evangelicals, certainly they put gender up front, didn't talk about race as much, right? Color blindness. And this is just a theology. It's not a racial identity or a cultural identity. And yet, when you go back to the early 20th century, the fundamentals, African-American pastors weren't invited into that. When you look at the National Association of Evangelicals, it was a white organization at its founding, despite theological affinities, right? And so history can make some of this plain to us. And yes, when it comes to gender, my own life story, I grew up in a Dutch Calvinist community. I, took entire courses on Calvin's institutes and, was deeply theological. And then I went to graduate school in the late 90s. And this was right at the rise of the Young, Restless, and Reformed and the, John Piper heyday. And I thought, good for us, right? Calvinists, we get our moment in the sun. This is great. And then I realized, this isn't there is no place for me as a woman, as an intellectual, as a woman who didn't believe that complementarianism was the only way to be faithful, right? I could say the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, right? I could embrace Calvin's Institutes, all of that, and there was no place for me. And so it was how orthodoxy was defined, how, what was the center of the faith? And when the center moves from, right, the core teachings of the scriptures, the love your neighbor as yourself and love God above all, going to those historic creeds and confessions, and is instead identified around gender roles, and then increasingly elaborate gender roles. I think inevitably the center ends up shifting, and who you see as an ally will end up shifting, which can end up transforming the faith itself because that core has shifted.
I remember teaching a class coinciding with the Southern Baptist Convention every year, and I would have students who would attend the meetings, and I would prepare them for it by saying, every family has the crazy uncle up in the attic, and so you have to be prepared for some crazy things that are going to be said at the microphone, but, that's family. And then as time went on, I realized, oh, wait, maybe I'm the uncle in the attic. Maybe that was the issue all along, is that I was the one out of step with all of this.
Right.
So, yeah.
No, it was quite something, I have to say, to be watching that from the outside, right? This is something when we connected in person, I told you that as a historian, I up until this book, I've only written about people who are long dead. And so to actually get to talk with you, a character in my book, is in itself thrilling, but also to have, been writing this book and then watching things play out in real time. It was a very strange experience. I'm sure it was even stranger to be living through and kind of realizing what was happening. What I will say too is that, to kind of bring, both race and gender into this conversation, as a conservative white man, some of these boundaries were probably not instantly evident to you. Because you could move freely in those spaces. Right. Whereas as a woman or as a person of color, I think some of these boundaries that had been set up, you couldn't help but bump up against. And so, I think that is perhaps worth noting. And and also, your experience, it became visible to you when you started pushing back against some of these, and then it was apparent just how significant these boundaries were.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. And I remember having a conversation with a group of, these were conservative, complementarian evangelical women who said, in a very, not in a oppositional way at all, in a very friendly way, said, we sense that some of the things that have been revealed over the past several years with sexual abuse and scandal and cover-ups and so forth, that this is deeply rattling to you. Yeah. And what we want you to know is that none of us are surprised.
Yes.
And so I looked around the room, and it didn't matter whether that was the 25-year-old woman who was a PhD student or the 70-year-old pastor's wife who was in the room. They all were saying, we're not surprised by some of the things that we've seen.
Yeah, I hear the same thing from Black Christians, especially those who have been in evangelical spaces. The response to this book among many white evangelicals is shock and recognition. Mm-hmm. Among Black Christians, it's recognition, absolutely zero shock. Like they say, thanks, Kristen, for writing this all down, but nothing new here, right? There's no shock there.
Yeah. Well, I kept you longer than I promised you I would because I've enjoyed the conversation. And so the book is Jesus and John Wayne. Can you tell us what you're working on now, or are you one of those scholars who likes to keep that a secret?
No, it's out there. It's public. My next book is called Live, Laugh, Love, and it is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood. So kind of similar to Jesus and John Wayne, but looking at how cultural products like Christian romance novels and mommy blogs and Hallmark movies and a whole host of other things shape religious, cultural, and political identities.
Well, that will be fascinating. I can't wait to read that. Kristen Du Mez, thanks so much for being on the program today.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
So, like I say, this wasn't really a tell me where I'm wrong episode. We didn't follow the format there. I just really wanted to have a conversation with her about this scholarship and about where she sees things going. But I think that the book, Jesus and John Wayne, what she said about, what Kristen said about a sense of shock and recognition, I think that's right. And I don't agree with her on all of it. I really do think that there is there is such a thing as evangelicalism that can be defined theologically. I just think it's probably a different group than we thought it was, or a smaller subset than we thought it was. And I think that sometimes people looked around and said, wait a minute, the things that we thought were the first order issues weren't the first order issues for all of us. And the things that we thought were minor notes were, for some of us, major notes. And so I think that's a big place where I would differ. But I think overall what the book is demonstrating and showing is that there is a kind of culturally defined masculinity wrapped up in the idea of fighting. I mean, you can see that not just in terms of the Driscoll and Trump stuff and so forth, but also the fact that there are many evangelical pastors I hear from all the time for whom the controversy is not just what they are saying. The controversy is that they're not angry at the right people, or they're not angry at the right volume. I think that really is identifying something dangerous and something that should be reformed. So this is Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe, send this episode to a friend if you think that they would enjoy it, and leave a review. If you could, that really helps people to find the show. And be sure to check out Christianity Today, lifting up the sages and storytellers of the church. You can click on the cover art to find out how you can get a free trial membership to check it out. This is Russell Moore, and you're listening to the Christianity Today Public Theology Project's Russell Moore Show.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Eric Petrick is our Chief Creative Officer. Russell Moore is the Executive Producer and Host. Mike Cosper is our Director of Podcasts. Production assistance by Core Media. Beth Gravencourt serves as Coordinator. Kevin Duthu, Producer. Audio mixing on today's episode by Kevin Duthu. Our theme song is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton. Administration for Christianity Today by Christine Kolb and Pam Vodanova. If you like what you heard on today's episode, make sure you subscribe to catch the upcoming episodes.